Historian, I'm always concerned about, in Nietzsche's famous formulation, the use and abuse of history. This is especially the case for those of us who work on the modern Middle East, and in particular the history of moments of large-scale human rights abuse, like the Armenian Genocide of 1915-1922. And while we are often confronted with the abuse of history in the form of genocide denial, or the more cumbersome sort of term negationism, we think less often in our more cynical age of the use of history. I'm interested in the use of history to confront denial, which is a falsification of history. But I want to take history one step further and think about how history can bring about forms of understanding that can both inoculate against the corrosive politics of denial, and in so doing protect against its influence on students, teachers, and the public, but also, and this is the hard part, promote reconciliation. My talk is divided into three parts. In the first, I outline a theory of Armenian genocide denial as a form of anti-historical historicism with identifiable modern origins. I then explore one of these moments as it unfolded at the League of Nations during the post-war humanitarian crisis, and finally present some preliminary thoughts on the question of hate in the past tense and the role of history in reconciliation. Denial is a constant of genocide. However, the origins of denial vary across the entire range of modern genocides. Holocaust denial, the most studied form, has its origins at the fringes of academic discourse and thrives in the shadows cast by anti-Semitism and 2 millenniums worth of Jew hatred. Holocaust denial is not the product of the state, and certainly not an official policy of contemporary Germany. To the contrary, the German acknowledgement of the Holocaust is state policy, and Germany has invested heavily, though only recently, in public monuments, museums, and memorials, not just to acknowledge, but to provide a historical explanation of the origins, causes, and outcomes of the Holocaust. This contrasts markedly with contemporary Turkey, where the state originates denial. It is state policy, as shown in pronouncement by Turkish diplomats, web pages maintained and sponsored by Turkey, and state-controlled public school curriculum, that the series of massacres and deportations, mass rape, enslavement, and forced servitude that eliminated the vast majority of Armenians physically and culturally from Ottoman Anatolia between 1915 and 1922 neither occurred to the extent historians of the Ottoman period have generally described, nor constitute, in retrospect, genocide. Moreover, the state puts elemental features of public culture and the very forms in which knowledge about the past is created and taught at the service of denial. Museums and a quasi-official state body, the Türk Kurum, the Turkish Historical Society, are enlisted to secure in Turkish society at large and in Turkish immigrant communities in Europe and the US the denial of the Armenian genocide as both an irreducible historical fact and a national imperative. A consensus has emerged amongst historians of modern Turkey that denial has been and continues to be part and parcel of a larger process of historical revisionism that legitimizes the seizure of power by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1922 and justifies a series of secularist, modernizing, anti-cosmopolitan, and ultra-nationalist policies associated with this regime and known collectively as Kemalism. This includes overstating the degree to which the identity of the Turk is an unambiguous national identity across time, that Anatolia has always been ethnically homogeneous and predominantly, if not exclusively, Turkish, and that any outrages against civilians in World War I were defensive in nature. In this sense, the events of the Armenian Genocide, if acknowledged at all, are situated in a broader structure of measures taken to defend the Turkish nation and the proto-Turkish state against external threats or internal enemies. Moreover, conceding the Turks or Turkey were capable of such atrocities is incommensurate with a nebulous Turkish national self or understanding of the inherent civility of Turks, again, as a distinctive vessel for a national identity. While the state and its institutions need to write a history for Turkey and Turks in which what happened to the Armenians and other minorities before, during, and after World War I is minimized or excised altogether from historical consciousness, forms the basis for the way we can understand the persistence of genocide denial. This current state project of writing an erasure does not account fully for the way denial was first enacted at the diplomatic and intellectual interface between Turkey and the West in the immediate wake of the genocide. Indeed, any approach that emphasizes exclusively the Kemalists, again, meaning the ultra-nationalist political project of the founder and first president of the Republic of Turkey, Kemalist origins of denial reduces, if not ignores altogether, the role of religious difference and subordination had in shaping the vocabulary and grammar of denial, that is a specific form of historical discourse in which the act of denial was packaged, or how it was related to realities presented by the multiple humanitarian crises of the post-war period and the international community's response to that crisis. Rather than seeing denial as a unique product of the nationalist era, or an expression of the formulation of post-Ottoman Turkish national subjectivity, I argue that this narrative also formed in the early 1920s in the crucible created by the modern humanitarian regime, and in particular, the international response to the plight of women and children genocide survivors. The basic terms of the humanitarian regime placed the residual Ottoman state in a publicly adversarial position against the West. More to the point, it had the effect of making the Ottoman Empire and the Turks the very antithesis of Wilsonian idealism, the overarching zeitgeist of that period. An outgrowth of the adversarial position was the intensification of calls for direct humanitarian intervention in Anatolia and Istanbul. More broadly, it had the effect of re-implicating a broad range of Ottoman social conduct during the war as morally repugnant, even perhaps indictable as a crime against humanity. Faced with this unique situation, Turkish diplomats, bureaucrats, and intellectuals reacted by formulating a coherent narrative of denial for use in rebuffing international public and diplomatic criticism of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey's treatment of women, children, and orphans, which I argue laid the groundwork for the denial of the genocide itself. Critically, this denialist narrative, which resonates with 19th century Ottoman public and diplomatic discourse on religious reform, civil equality, and abolition, and has since remained relatively stable in its structure and means, was designed to defend the Ottoman Empire and its elite against a specific set of challenges, implicit and explicit, in the emerging history of the Armenian genocide that suffused this new environment of humanitarian intervention and retroactive justification of World War I. For these bureaucrats and diplomats, the price of losing the argument with that history was not just academic, but carried with it the potential of further territorial dismemberment of the empire and certainly a loss of political sovereignty. Less overt, but no less important, was how this counter-narrative, cloaked in claims of sovereignty and national victimization, Muslim entitlement to political, social, and cultural preeminence in the Ottoman Empire and its Republican successor, as well as practices associated with domestic patriarchy and forms of slavery. At the same time, Ottoman diplomats used an early species of cultural relativism, even claims of Islamophobia, in the face of calls by the West for civil equality, and if not complete, then at least a limited form of female and non-Muslim emancipation. Thus, rather than merely not coming to terms with genocide at that moment, especially in conjunction with post-war movements for restorative justice for survivor communities, the Ottoman state and its elite representatives' vehement and intransigent opposition to elemental features of the League of Nations humanitarian efforts, both the underlying ethos and strategies for ameliorating the effects of genocide on the Armenians, exposed a critical tension in the social history of late Ottoman and early Turkish society, and its Muslim and non-Muslim communities that manifested in a complex amalgam of policies, attitudes, fears, and hatred. Situating the history of denial in the context of international humanitarianism and post-World War I human rights thinking can also shed light on not just how instances of genocide denial formed before the Holocaust, but also in this case, bring into relief what the motives and strategies of denial can tell us about the larger social implications of the modern ideological formulation of human rights in the non-West. Finally, thinking about denial in this fashion also creates a space in which to reflect critically on how history as both a discipline and practice operates in the spheres of power and public opinion, especially across political and cultural divides. The historical experience of the formulation of denial in this case gives added meaning to Walter Benjamin's observation, quote, "To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was, Ronka. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger," unquote. However, in this case, the moment of danger required the erasure of a memory, It produced less a memory than its reverse. Thus, understanding genocide denial in the early interwar period is more than just a step in correcting or confronting a mistake in the historical record, but rather constitutes a form of social history where the very crisis that caused denial brings into relief, to borrow a phrase from Foucault, competing quote-unquote regimes of truth that are both a product of and essential referent of ideological and religious doxa. Hayden White's discussion of Droysen's Historique is suggestive of the kind of use denial, itself a species of historicism, has. Quote, its function is less to rationalize a given social system than to serve as the very paradigm of realistic discourse by which any putative realism threatening to the social status quo can be dismissed as utopian, idealist, mythical, illusory, reductionist, or otherwise distorted, unquote. In presenting a coherent narrative of denial as a paradigmatic regime of truth, the whole range of interwar idealism, from the political dimensions of Wilsonianism to the rights of women and children, Muslim, non-Muslim equality, that drew a degree of support and justification for what had happened during the genocide and resulting humanitarian disasters, could be written off. It was the first act in reducing the history of the genocide on the part of Ottoman and then the Turkish state to merely to the historical delusions of a handful of ex-missionaries, female dilettante enthusiasts advocating for irrelevant components of society, or the spokesman of a few disgruntled and spiteful minorities.